Now that we've created the contract and the database, we should be ready to add and retrieve data. Let's start by implementing a query that will retrieve all our guests and display them in the UI. But how will we retrieve anything when we haven't even added any guests to the database yet? Well, that's why we've provided you with some code that will insert fake data directly into the database. This way you can test your own query and check if your code works as expected. Soon afterwards, we will be implementing adding and removing guests to complete our app. This exercise will be using the project titled Exercise Get All the Data. To retrieve all the data in a database, we need to run an SQL query that will select everything in the waitlist table. And to be able to run SQL queries in Android, we will be using the DB helper class that we created in the previous exercise. So the first thing to do in main activity is to declare a variable of type SQLite database. This will be our reference to the actual SQL database linked into this app. And then inside the main activities onCreate method, declare and initialize a DB helper object from the waitlist DB helper class and pass in this as the context. Then set the MDB database to dbhelper.getWritable-database. If we weren't inserting any data, but just interested in reading data, we could use a getReadable-database instead of getWritable-database here. But because in a minute we'll be filling the database with fake data, we actually need a writable database reference. To fill the database with fake data, we've provided you with a testUtil class. Inside, there's a method called insertFakeData that just takes a database reference as an input, and it will automatically add 5 guests to the database. Awesome. Now let's create a new method called getAllGuests that will actually return everything in the database. Our method getAllGuests returns the result in a type called cursor. A cursor is what any SQL query result will be stored in. The cursor class allows you to iterate over the query result in a very easy and simple way, as we'll see soon. So now it's time to create and run the actual SQL query. To do that, we call the query method in the database instance we've created earlier, MDB. This method can take quite a number of parameters. Here we're only setting the first and the last one, the first being the table name and the last being the order by column that we're interested in. And we can get both of those from the contract constants that we declared before. Notice that we're ordering by the timestamp column because that's the order that we want to display the guests with. The second parameter here is something called a projection array. Here you can specify an array of columns that you're interested in returning in your query. But because we're interested in everything in the table, we're just passing in null. The same goes for the rest of the parameters. If you want to know more, if you're interested, check out the Android documentation for SQLite database query method. So now our getAllGuests function is ready, since we just returned the result of that query. So let's go back and call it right after we insert our fake data. And so we can store the result in a cursor variable. But to test that getAllGuests actually work, we need to update the adapter to accept an integer representing the count of guests in the returned cursor. This will reflect in the recycler view, showing a list of guests that is as long as the count specified. So let's open our guest list adapter and modify it. First thing, declare an integer called mCount that will store and remember the count that's passed into the adapter. Then update the adapter to accept this integer as a new argument. And inside the adapter, make sure you set this local member to the passed in count. And then finally scroll down and make sure you update the getItemCount method to return the actual count rather than just 0. Perfect. Now let's go back to our main activity and make sure that we're passing the cursor.getCount as another input to our adapter. This way, depending on the result in the cursor, the adapter would let the recycler view display a list that's that long. When you run the application, it does show 5 guests in the list, but it only shows the default name and the party size. That's because we're only passing in the count to the adapter, not the actual names or the party sizes. However, there seems to be only 5 of them in the list, which is exactly what we expected. Cool. Looks like we're getting at least closer now. Next, we'll see how to fix this default text and show the actual names and party sizes. But before that, just make sure you've tried what we've done yourself and see if you can get the same result when you run it.